The splintered wood of the fence post dug into her palm, a sharp, grounding pain in a world that had dissolved into a blur of motion and sound. Behind her, the rhythmic panting of the dog grew louder, a wet, menacing metronome counting down the seconds she had left. Each rasping breath was punctuated by the scrabble of claws on pavement, a sound that promised teeth and tearing. Lily's own breath came in ragged, useless gulps. Her small lungs burned, and the cold night air felt like swallowing glass. She risked a glance over her shoulder. The German shepherd, a shadow of muscle and fury named Zeus by the man who owned him, was closer now, its eyes gleaming under the jaundiced glow of a distant streetlight. Its master was nowhere to be seen, but his voice still echoed in her memory, a deceptively soft command that had unleashed this terror. "Go on, boy. She needs to learn to stay put." She scrambled forward, her worn sneakers slipping on a patch of damp leaves. The fence was too high to climb, a solid wall of weathered pine that boxed her into the alley. Dead end. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the haze of her exhaustion. Her eyes darted around, searching for an escape, a crack, a hole, anything. There was only brick, dumpsters, and a single windowless metal garage door, its gray paint peeling in leprous flakes. It looked as sealed and final as a tomb, but from behind it she could hear a low rumble, a deep, resonant vibration that she could feel in the soles of her feet. It wasn't the sound of a single car engine, it was something more, a chorus of idling power that hummed with latent energy. It was a sound that should have been frightening, a warning of its own, but right now it was the only thing in the world besides the approaching dog. Zeus let out a sharp, frustrated bark, now only 20 feet away. The sound shattered her paralysis. There was no choice. She threw herself at the garage door, her small fists beating a frantic, desperate rhythm against the cold, unyielding metal. The sound was pathetic, a tinny, hollow thudding swallowed by the vastness of the night and the growl of the beast behind her. "Please," she whispered, the word a choked sob. "Please help me." The dog was gathering itself to spring, its body low to the ground, a coiled spring of violence. With a final surge of adrenaline, Lily balled her fist and pounded again, harder this time, screaming the word she had been too afraid to utter for months. "Help!" The low rumble from inside the garage abruptly ceased. In its place was a sudden, profound silence, an auditory void that was somehow more intimidating than the noise it had replaced. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Zeus crept closer, a low growl vibrating in its chest. Then, with a groan of protesting metal and the sharp, definitive click of a heavy deadbolt being thrown, the door began to move. It didn't open fully, but a smaller, man-sized door cut into its center, swung inward, spilling a rectangle of warm, yellow light into the greasy darkness of the alley. A giant silhouette filled the frame, a man so large he seemed to block out the light behind him. Lily stumbled back, her terror simply trading one object for another. The dog, momentarily confused by the sudden change, paused its advance, its head cocked. From the darkness of the garage, a voice, calm and impossibly deep, rumbled out. "What's the trouble, little one?" Lily had learned silence was a shield. It was a cloak of invisibility she wore to navigate the fragile world her life had become since her mother's illness had settled in like a permanent winter fog. Her mother, once a vibrant source of laughter and warmth, was now a ghost in her own home, drifting from bed to couch, her body waging a quiet, exhausting war that left no energy for anything else. The move to this small, forgotten town was supposed to be a fresh start, a cheaper place to live where the air was cleaner and neighbors, theoretically, looked out for each other. But for Lily, it was just a deeper isolation. She was the new girl, the quiet one whose clothes were a little too worn, whose lunch was always the same simple sandwich. She learned to make herself small, to take up less space, to need less. She became an expert at reading the subtle shifts in her mother's breathing, at knowing when to bring a glass of water without being asked, at tidying the small apartment so her mother wouldn't have to look at the mess and feel the sting of her own helplessness. Mr. Abernathy, the neighbor from the house across the street, had seemed like a gift. He was a pillar of the community, a retired school principal with a perfectly manicured lawn and a kind, crinkling smile. He brought them a casserole the first week they moved in. He offered to drive her mother to doctor's appointments. He told Lily she was a brave little soldier. At first, his attention felt like sunlight. He'd call her over to help with his prize-winning roses, paying her $1 for pulling weeds. He'd tell her stories about the town's history, making her feel like she belonged somewhere for the first time. He made her feel seen. But soon, the sunlight began to carry a chill. The favors came with strings. "This is our little secret, right, Lily? No need to bother your mother with it." The secrets started small. A shared piece of chocolate cake he told her not to mention because of her mother's diet. A late-night chat on his porch when she was supposed to be in bed. Then the secrets grew darker, heavier. He started asking her to do things for him, small errands inside his house, which was always unnervingly tidy, a museum where nothing was ever out of place. He had a rule: never touch anything without asking. Another rule: never go into the basement. One afternoon, while she was dusting his collection of ship models, she dropped a cloth behind a heavy bookcase. When she knelt to retrieve it, she saw a small, almost invisible line in the wallpaper, a door. Her curiosity, a thing she had tried so hard to suppress, flared to life. Later, when he was in the garden, she pushed on it. It opened into a narrow, steep staircase leading down into darkness, a strange, chemical smell, like bleach and something else. Something vaguely metallic drifted up. She heard his footsteps on the porch and quickly shut the hidden door, her heart hammering against her ribs. When he came inside, he seemed to know. He didn't yell. He just smiled, that tight, crinkling smile, and said, "Curiosity is a dangerous thing for little girls, Lily. Some doors are best left closed." The next day, he showed her Zeus. "He's a very good listener," Mr. Abernathy had said, stroking the dog's massive head. "He helps me make sure my friends keep their promises." The threat was unspoken but perfectly clear. The secrets were no longer just secrets. They were cages. And tonight, when she had finally said she wanted to go home, that she didn't want to play his games anymore, he had let the dog out. He hadn't chased her. He had simply stood on his porch, a silhouette against his brightly lit house, and watched. Inside the garage, the air was thick with the scent of motor oil, worn leather, and brewing coffee. This was the clubhouse of the Sentinels Motorcycle Club, but it bore no resemblance to the chaotic dens depicted in movies. It was a workshop, meticulously organized. Tools hung in precise outlines on a pegboard wall. Engine parts, cleaned and polished to a gleam, were laid out on oilcloth-covered tables like surgical instruments. 10 men were present, their meeting interrupted by the frantic knocking. They were not the wild, lawless bikers of public imagination. They were veterans, mechanics, a lawyer, a former paramedic. They were men who had seen the worst of the world and had chosen to build their own order within it. Their code was simple and absolute. You protect your brothers, you honor your word, and you stand between the innocent and the dark. This last rule was the bedrock of their existence, an unspoken penance for pasts that were rarely discussed but universally understood. Presiding over the meeting was Gideon, the club president, a man in his late 50s with a face like a roadmap of hard miles. His calm demeanor masked a formidable intensity. His patch, a stylized raven with its wings unfurled, was a symbol of watchfulness. He had lost his own daughter years ago, not to violence, but to a silent, insidious sickness, the hole she'd left in his life. had been filled with a fierce paternal protectiveness for all who were defenseless. Beside him sat Bear, the man who now stood in the doorway. He was a mountain of a man, his arms covered in intricate tattoos that told the story of a life before the club, a life of pain and anger that he had painstakingly reshaped into quiet strength. Bear worked with at-risk youth, his immense size a surprising comfort to children who had only ever known threats from smaller, crueler men. Across the room, Marcus, the club's secretary and a practicing attorney, was reviewing their finances. He had walked away from a lucrative corporate law firm after witnessing the casual corruption that protected the wealthy and punished the poor. He now used his legal acumen to defend the defenseless, often pro bono, his work for the club a form of moral recalibration. They were in the middle of planning their annual charity run for the local children's hospital when Lily's desperate pleas had cut through the night. The silence that followed her cry was one of absolute focus. Every man in that room, from the youngest prospect to Gideon himself, had turned their attention to the door, their instincts, honed by years of practice, instantly shifting from fraternal calm to high alert. When Bear moved to open the door, it was with the deliberate, unhurried motion of a man who knew that panic was a luxury you could never afford. The little girl who stumbled into the light of the garage was a study in terror. She was no older than 9 or 10, with wide, haunted eyes and a smudge of dirt on her cheek that looked like a bruise in the dim light. Her breath came in hiccuping sobs, and she was clutching a small, tattered-looking book to her chest, as if it were a shield. Bear instinctively knelt, making himself smaller, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "It's okay, you're safe now. What's chasing you?" Before she could answer, the German shepherd appeared at the edge of the light, its lips curled back in a snarl. It didn't advance, held at bay by the sight of the large man and the scent of so many others inside. Without turning, Bear spoke in that same calm tone. "Coyote door." A younger member, lean and quick, moved silently to the main garage door controls. Gideon stepped forward, moving past Bear to place himself between the child and the entrance. He didn't look at the dog. His focus was entirely on her. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice steady and even. "Lily," she whispered, her eyes fixed on his leather vest, on the raven patch over his heart. "Lily," he repeated softly, "my name is Gideon. You're safe with us. Who does the dog belong to?" Her gaze darted back towards the alley, her fear palpable. "Mr. Abernathy," she stammered. He let him out. He told me I shouldn't have gone looking." Gideon's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He recognized the name. Abernathy was a local big shot, a former principal involved in every town committee, the kind of man who radiated untouchable respectability. "Looking for what, Lily?" This was the moment, the point where a frightened child's story could dissolve into a confusing, dismissible jumble. But Lily's fear had burned away everything but the essential, terrifying truth. She held up the tattered book. It was an old, cheap diary, the kind with a flimsy lock that a hairpin could open. "His book," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I found it, in the little room. He writes things down. Names." Gideon crouched down to her level, his movements slow and deliberate. The other men in the room remained perfectly still, a silent circle of witnesses. The air grew thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the dog still growling in the alley. It was the chilling recognition of a familiar evil, an evil that wore a friendly face. "What kind of little room, Lily?" Gideon asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked him straight in the eye, and the words that came out were clear, precise, and utterly damning. "The one behind the wall in his library, with the special locks on the outside of the door, and the little window, the one he looks through. The dog in the alley was forgotten. A new predator had just been named. The walk to Abernathy's house was not a charge. It was a procession. Gideon, Bear, and Marcus moved with a deliberate, unnerving calm. The rest of the sentinels remained at the clubhouse, forming a protective perimeter around Lily, who was now safely inside, wrapped in a warm blanket and sipping a cup of hot chocolate that one of the members had produced from a surprisingly well-stocked kitchen. They had her book, the diary, tucked safely away. Marcus had put on a pair of leather gloves before he even touched it. As the three men crossed the street, the neighborhood was quiet, basking in the deceptive peace of suburbia. Abernathy's house was the nicest on the block, a two-story colonial with pristine white siding and cheerful yellow shutters. A light was on in the downstairs living room. Zeus was now chained to the porch railing, and he started barking furiously as they approached. Abernathy opened the door before they even knocked. He was wearing a cardigan and a practiced, concerned smile. He was the very picture of a kindly, put-upon neighbor. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth as honey, "can I help you? I hope my dog hasn't caused any trouble. He can be a bit overzealous when he's excited." Gideon stood on the top step, his presence alone a form of pressure. "Your dog was chasing a little girl," he stated, his voice flat and devoid of accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. Abernathy's smile widened, becoming a mask of patronizing sympathy. "Ah, you must mean little Lily. Such a troubled child. Her mother is quite ill, you know. She has a habit of wandering and telling stories. I was just about to call her mother to let her know she'd run off again." He was good. He was already painting a picture, laying the foundation of doubt. Lily was imaginative, disturbed, a liar. He was the concerned citizen. Marcus stepped forward slightly, positioning himself next to Gideon. "She said you let the dog out to chase her." Abernathy's expression shifted to one of mild offense. "Of course not. I opened the door and he bolted after a squirrel. Lily just happened to be in the way. She's a very sensitive girl. I'm sure it frightened her." He was deflecting, twisting, controlling the narrative. He looked past them, down the street towards the clubhouse. "Is she with you? I really should get her home. Her mother will be worried sick." It was a clever move, an attempt to reframe them as the villains, a group of rough-looking bikers holding a child against her will. But Gideon didn't take the bait. He held Abernathy's gaze, his eyes like chips of granite. "She's safe," he said. "She told us something interesting. She mentioned a little room in your library." The change was almost imperceptible, but to men trained to observe, it was as loud as a gunshot. A flicker in Abernathy's eyes, a slight tightening of his jaw. The hand resting on the doorknob gripped it a little harder, his knuckles turning white. The kindly neighbor mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the cold, predatory calculation beneath. He recovered quickly, letting out a small, condescending chuckle. "Oh, that, my old storm cellar. I keep it locked for safety, of course, full of rusty tools and spiders. You can see how a child with an active imagination might turn that into something sinister." Bear, who had been silent until now, spoke for the first time, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in Abernathy's chest. "She said the locks were on the outside." Abernathy's smile vanished completely. His eyes darted from face to face, the cornered animal finally realizing the trap was not where he thought it was. "I think you've overstayed your welcome," he said, his voice losing its warmth, turning brittle and sharp. "If you don't leave my property, I will call the police." "We were just about to suggest the same thing," Marcus replied calmly, pulling out his phone. The confrontation was over, but the war had just begun. Returning to the clubhouse, the atmosphere was one of grim purpose. Lily had fallen asleep on a worn leather sofa, her small form looking impossibly fragile against the backdrop of chrome and steel. The diary lay on the main table, a toxic object they all seemed to avoid looking at directly. Marcus had already made the first call, not to the local police, but to a retired state detective he trusted, a man named Henderson who owed him a favor. He explained the situation in precise, legally sound language, focusing on credible threat and a child's disclosure, carefully omitting the more sensational details about the club's involvement for now. Henderson listened, and the silence on the other end of the line was heavy. He knew what Marcus was not saying. A man of Abernathy's standing was insulated by his reputation. A direct accusation from a motorcycle club on behalf of a troubled child would be dismissed before it was even investigated. They needed a different angle. Henderson's advice was clear. They needed an official entry point, someone on the inside who would take the disclosure seriously. He gave them a name, Detective Miller, a new transfer to the local precinct, a man with a reputation for being stubborn and thorough, unburdened by the town's old boy network. The next morning, Gideon and Marcus went to the station. They didn't wear their club vests, opting for plain jackets, a strategic decision to minimize prejudice. They asked for Miller specifically. The detective was a man in his 40s with tired eyes and a healthy dose of professional skepticism. He listened to their story, his expression unreadable. "So let me get this straight," he said, leaning back in his squeaking chair. "A girl runs from a dog, ends up with your organization, and tells you the most respected man in town has a secret dungeon in his basement?" The condescension was subtle but clear. Marcus slid a file across the desk. It contained a typed formal statement from Lily, which he had carefully transcribed from her own words. He had also included a brief factual report on their interaction with Abernathy. "She didn't say dungeon, detective," Marcus said evenly. "She gave specific, verifiable details. A hidden door behind a bookcase in the library, a steep staircase, a chemical smell, and locks on the outside of a basement room. She also drew a picture." He placed a piece of paper on top of the file. It was a child's drawing, crude but clear. It showed a room with a single bed, a small table, and a tiny, high-up window. A stick figure labeled "Me" was inside, and another stick figure labeled Mr. A was outside, its eye pressed to the window. Miller stared at the drawing. For the first time, a flicker of something other than cynicism crossed his face. Children's drawings had a way of cutting through the noise. They were pure testimony. While the men were at the station, Bear had another idea. He knew Lily had to be a student at the local elementary school. He called the school, identified himself as a concerned community member, and asked to speak to the principal about a student's welfare. He was eventually passed to Lily's teacher, a woman named Sarah Albright. As Bear carefully explained that Lily was safe but had experienced a frightening incident, Ms. Albright's silence on the other end of the phone was telling. "Thank God," she finally breathed, her voice thick with relief and worry. "I knew something was wrong. She's been so withdrawn, so quiet. She used to love drawing, but for the past month all her pictures have been dark. Lots of shadows and cages. I filed 2 reports with the school counselor, but because Mr. Abernathy is such a benefactor to the school, a friend of the library, they told me I was overreacting. An ally had been found, an ally with a paper trail. Ms. Albright agreed to meet with Detective Miller and share her concerns and her students' artwork. The gears of justice, long rusted with complacency and deference to power, were beginning to groan slowly into motion. Detective Miller's initial wellness check was a bust. Armed with Ms. Albright's corroborating concerns, he had enough to justify a visit, but not a warrant. Abernathy welcomed him with the same performance of polite concern he had shown the Sentinels. He gave Miller a full tour of the house. The library was immaculate. There was no visible sign of a hidden door. He even opened the main basement door, revealing a normal, musty cellar filled with storage boxes and holiday decorations. He explained that the chemical smell was likely the fertilizer he used for his roses stored near the foundation. He was plausible, charming, and in complete control. Miller left feeling unsettled but empty-handed. He had seen nothing illegal. The system, for the moment, had failed. Abernathy had won the first round. But the Sentinels did not operate according to the system's timetable. When Miller called Marcus to report his findings, there was no anger or disappointment in his voice, only a calm resolve. "Thank you for trying, Detective," he said. "We'll maintain our own watch." The next day, the public reckoning began. It started quietly. 2 motorcycles, polished to a mirror shine, were parked on the public street directly opposite Abernathy's house. On them sat 2 members of the Sentinels, impassive and silent. They didn't speak. They didn't threaten. They just sat, their presence a silent, unwavering accusation. They were there when Abernathy left to get his morning paper. They were there when he returned from his errands. They sat in 2-hour shifts, around-the-clock vigil. The neighborhood began to notice. Curtains twitched. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones over their fences. Who were these men? Why were they watching the kind Mr. Abernathy? Abernathy tried to ignore it, then he tried to fight it. He called the police to complain about harassment. A patrol car would arrive, speak with the bikers, and leave. They weren't breaking any laws. They were on a public street. Frustrated, Abernathy leveraged his influence. He called the local newspaper, spinning a story about a dangerous motorcycle gang intimidating a law-abiding citizen. The resulting article was a masterpiece of biased reporting, headlined, "Community Leader Harassed by Outlaw Bikers." It painted Abernathy as the victim and the Sentinels as violent thugs. For a day, public opinion sided with him. People glared at the silent bikers. A few yelled insults from passing cars. The Sentinels did not react. Their discipline was absolute. They were anchors in a storm of speculation. The turning point came at a hastily called town meeting, ostensibly to discuss community safety. Abernathy was there, accepting sympathetic handshakes, playing the part of the besieged hero. He spoke about the need to stand up to intimidation. Then Ms. Albright stood up to speak. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger with every word. She didn't mention the Sentinels. She spoke about Lily. She spoke about a bright, happy child who had grown fearful and silent. She held up copies of Lily's drawings for everyone to see. The dark scribbles, the houses with bars on the windows, the monstrous-looking stick figures. "This is not the work of a child with an overactive imagination," she declared, her voice ringing through the silent hall. "This is the work of a child who is terrified, and we, as a community, have been looking the other way." Her words shifted the energy in the room. People began to look at Abernathy differently. The whispers changed from sympathy for him to concern for the unseen child. The silent watch of the Sentinels had forced the town to stop and pay attention, and now Ms. Albright was giving them a reason to believe their eyes. The public narrative was beginning to crack. The pressure created by the vigil and Ms. Albright's public stand was immense. Detective Miller found himself fielding calls from concerned parents and school board members. The story was no longer just about bikers and a runaway. It was about a child's safety and institutional failure. This gave him the leverage he needed. He went back to Lily, this time with a child advocacy specialist. In the safe, quiet environment of the Sentinels' clubhouse, away from any pressure, Lily provided the final crucial piece of evidence. She remembered something else about the hidden room. "He has a box," she said quietly. "A metal box under the bed. It has more books in it, like mine, and pictures." She then took a crayon and, on a fresh piece of paper, drew the lock on the box. It wasn't a normal lock. It was a specific type of combination dial lock, with a small, distinctive brand logo she painstakingly reproduced from memory. This was the key, a verifiable, specific detail that Abernathy couldn't explain away. Armed with this new information and a sworn affidavit from Ms. Albright, Miller convinced a judge to sign a search warrant. This time, the search would be thorough. The raid was executed at dawn. The forensic team didn't bother with the main basement. They went straight to the library, tapping along the walls until they found the hollow spot behind the bookcase. The hidden door was expertly concealed, but it couldn't hide from modern technology. When they forced it open, the chemical smell of bleach was overwhelming. The room was exactly as Lily had described: small, windowless, with a single cot and a small table. And under the cot, they found the metal box. The lock was the exact model Lily had drawn. When they opened it, the contents were horrifying. It held a collection of diaries, small trinkets, and photographs of at least 6 other children, all former students from the school where Abernathy had been principal. It was a predator's trophy case. The arrest of Arthur Abernathy sent a shockwave through the town. The man they had admired as a civic leader was a monster. The trial was a quiet, methodical affair. The prosecution, led by a determined district attorney, built an ironclad case. The diaries, the photographs, and the physical evidence from the hidden room were undeniable. Other victims, now teenagers, were found and came forward, their old stories of the creepy principal suddenly cast in a horrifying new light. The defense tried to paint Lily as a troubled fantasist, but her testimony, delivered via closed-circuit television with a therapy dog at her feet, was devastating in its simple, honest clarity. She described the room, the smell, the look in his eyes when he slid the bolt on the outside of the door. Throughout the trial, members of the Sentinels sat in the back of the courtroom. They never wore their club colors, just simple, dark clothing. They were a silent, constant presence, a promise to the little girl on the screen that she was not alone. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict on all counts, a quiet sigh of relief went through the gallery. Abernathy, his face a crumbling mask of indignation, was sentenced to life in prison. Justice, in its slow, grinding way, had been delivered. As Gideon watched the bailiffs lead Abernathy away, he caught Lily's mother's eye across the courtroom. She gave him a small, tearful nod of gratitude. In the back row, Detective Miller closed his notebook, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. The system had worked, but only because a handful of outsiders had refused to let it fail. The conviction of Arthur Abernathy was not an ending, but a beginning. The town, shaken from its complacency, had to confront the uncomfortable truth that a monster had thrived in its midst for years, protected by his reputation and their collective willingness to look the other way. The scandal triggered a cascade of reforms. The school district, facing a torrent of lawsuits and public outrage, completely overhauled its child protection policies. The Ms. Albright rule, as it came to be known, was implemented, mandating that any report of child distress from a teacher, no matter how subtle, automatically triggered an independent review by a third-party child advocacy group, bypassing the internal school administration. Teacher training was revamped to include recognizing the subtle signs of trauma and abuse, using Lily's drawings as a case study. The Sentinels, once viewed with suspicion, became unlikely local heroes. The story, picked up by national news outlets, transformed their image from outlaw bikers to guardian angels. Donations poured into their modest clubhouse. Gideon, uncomfortable with the praise, funneled all of it into a new foundation. In partnership with the Child Advocacy Center that had helped Lily, they established Lily's House, a safe haven and resource center for at-risk children and their families. It offered counseling, legal aid, and temporary housing. Bear, using his experience with troubled youth, was appointed to its board of directors. The clubhouse garage, once a private sanctuary, now hosted a monthly wrench night for local kids, teaching them basic mechanics and offering them a safe place to find mentorship and community. Surrounded by the reassuring rumble of well-tended engines, Detective Miller was promoted, his dogged pursuit of the case held up as an example of proper police work. He made a point of regularly attending town meetings, not as an officer, but as a citizen, fostering a new culture of communication between the police and the community they served. The fear and suspicion that had allowed Abernathy to operate in the shadows was slowly replaced by a sense of shared responsibility. Neighborhood watch programs were revitalized, but with a new focus, not on property crime but on the well-being of the neighborhood's children. People started talking to each other more, learning the names of the kids on their street, creating the kind of genuine community that Abernathy's superficial charm had only ever mimicked. The empty house on the corner with its pristine lawn and dark secrets was eventually sold, its interior gutted and rebuilt by a new family, its ghosts exorcised by the laughter of new children. The legacy of that terrible time was not the trauma Abernathy had inflicted, but the strength and vigilance his exposure had forged. The world, or at least this small corner of it, was measurably safer, all because one little girl had been brave enough to knock on a door, and the men inside had been wise enough to listen. A year has passed. The late afternoon sun streams through the kitchen window of a small, cheerful house on the other side of town, painting golden stripes across a wooden table. Lily sits at the table, her tongue poked out in concentration as she draws. Her hair has grown longer, and the haunted look in her eyes has been replaced by a quiet confidence. Her mother, healthier now, hums softly as she prepares dinner, the scent of roasting chicken filling the air. The house is filled with the comfortable, easy sounds of a life reclaimed. On the refrigerator, held up by a collection of colorful magnets, is a gallery of Lily's recent artwork. There are no more cages or shadows. Instead, there are bright suns, smiling animals, and a recurring motif of a large, gentle bear and a man with a raven on his jacket. Outside, a familiar sound begins to grow, a low, rhythmic rumble that makes the windows vibrate slightly. It is not a sound of menace. To Lily, it is the sound of safety, the sound of family. She doesn't even look up from her drawing, a small smile playing on her lips. A few moments later, the front door opens and Gideon and Bear step inside, their large frames filling the doorway. They have shed their heavy leather vests, and they move with a gentle deference in the small domestic space. "Smells good in here, Maria," Gideon says to Lily's mother, who greets them with a warm hug. Bear walks over to the table and peers over Lily's shoulder. "What you drawin', little bird?" he rumbles. She holds up the picture. It's a drawing of the Sentinel's clubhouse, but instead of tools on the walls, there are flowers. A line of gleaming motorcycles is parked out front, and standing beside them are a dozen smiling stick figures, all holding hands, with a small girl in the center. Gideon pulls a small, smooth gray stone from his pocket and places it on the table next to her crayons. It's a worry stone, worn smooth by countless miles and a restless thumb. "For your pocket," he says simply, "in case you ever feel scared." Lily picks it up. It's cool and solid in her hand. She looks up at him, her eyes clear and bright. "I'm not scared anymore," she says. He nods, a deep and ancient sadness in his eyes, momentarily eclipsed by a fierce pride. He knows that scars remain, that healing is a long road, but he also knows that the journey has begun. Later, as the sun sets, they all sit in the backyard, sharing a meal. The conversation is easy, filled with talk of school, of plans for the next charity run, of the funny thing the cat did that morning. It is a scene of profound and simple peace. The Sentinels will eventually ride on, their journey endless, their watch perpetual. But tonight they are not bikers or guardians. They are simply family gathered in the warm glow of a promise kept, a quiet testament to the truth that the strongest walls are not made of brick or stone, but of the courage to protect a child and the love that rebuilds a world in her image.